We're live.
Hello everyone, welcome back to ILS's lecture series on biopolitics. Joining us this week is Dr. Thomas Lemke. Thomas Lemke is a professor of sociology at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Goethe University Frankfurt and the author of several books, including Foucault's analysis of modern governmentality, a critique of political reason, and Biopolitics, an advanced introduction. As these titles already suggest, he generally focuses on concepts drawn from the works on Michel Foucault, and in today's lecture, he will focus on two such concepts, the milieu and governmentality, which allow for a non-anthropological understanding of biopolitics. Before we begin the lecture, a quick reminder. As always, you can leave comments or questions for the lecture in the YouTube chat, which you can find on the right side of the video stream. And now, without further ado, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for the introduction, also for inviting me to this interesting format lecture series on biopolitics. Maybe I should, before I start, I should maybe say something about the context of the talk. What I'm going to talk about today is material from an upcoming book entitled The Government of Things, Foucault and the New Materialisms. And the book will come out in September with New York University Press, and it engages with the so-called new materialisms and tries to spell out some Foucauldian concepts like the dispositif, technology, or the milieu, to give flesh to something that Foucault once called the government of things. And the context of my talk today, the idea of a not focused biopolitics that is not focused on humans, is in a way is one part of this theoretical engagement with Foucault and updates of governmentality, so to say. Okay, so this might explain some things that you will find lacking in what I'm going to talk about. So it's a very dense version of certain parts of the book. Okay, and now I'm going to start, and I will share the screen. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Let's see. So that it's easier for you to follow, because there's sometimes quite extensive quotes, and it will be easier for you to follow the presentation. Okay, so we can start then. Donna Haraway has argued that Foucault's critical project did not sufficiently destabilize anthropocentrism and remained confined to analyzing relations among humans. According to this extremely influential account, Foucault's work is seriously hampered by what she calls species chauvinism. Species chauvinism that curtails the analytic and critical value of Foucault's work. In a similar vein, Nicole Schuken has claimed that Foucault's insight into the working of biopolitics, I quote, bumps into its own internal limit of the species line, end of quote. In this perspective, concepts like governmentality and biopolitics are centered on human populations, unable to address the complexities of human-non-human relationships or the impact of governmental rationalities and technologies beyond human collectives. In this talk, I would like to advance an alternative reading of Foucault's work. It builds on elements of his writings to spell out the contours of a more than human concept of biopolitics. I will start by analyzing the significance and the dimensions of the notion of milieu in Foucault's lectures on governmentality at the Collège de France of 1978 and 1979. After reconstructing this brief genealogy of the term, the second section demonstrates that milieu constitutes an integral element in the emergence of a liberal governmentality in the 18th century that seeks to govern aleatory events. The third section proposes a concept of biopolitics informed by an understanding of the milieu as a medium of government. This non-anthropocentric framing of biopolitics no longer exclusively addresses human individuals and populations, but it tends to the co-constitution of humans and non-humans. And finally, I present Foucault's concept of environmentality as a way of capturing a new constellation of power in which contemporary modes of government seek to modulate and control the social, ecological, and technological conditions of life. So I start with the first part, genealogy of the milieu. Foucault undertakes a brief genealogy of the milieu in his lectures of 1978 and 1979 at the Collège de France. For him, the milieu is an integral element of liberal governmentality. Foucault argues that the concept and practice of milieu first emerged in the 18th century, and he distinguishes three different steps in its emergence. First, the milieu makes a technical appearance in Western European towns in the later years of the 18th century. The interplay of different factors, such as the suppression of city walls to facilitate trade and economic exchange, the increase in the urban population raising serious health issues, and the challenge of crime prevention, all these factors made it necessary to supervise and administer the movements of human and non-human entities. I quote Foucault, "It was a matter of organizing circulation, eliminating its dangerous elements, making a division between good and bad circulation, and maximizing the good circulation by diminishing the bad." End of quote. Foucault notes that the term milieu did not yet appear in the programmatic texts and systematic reflections of the architects and town planners of that time. However, the technical scheme, as he calls it, of the notion quite obviously informed their practices and the actual modification of urban spaces. Even, and again a quote by Foucault, even before the notion was formed and isolated, the milieu then will be that in which circulation is carried out. End of quote. Secondly, the idea of the milieu emerges in physics, operating as an exploratory resource to account for action at a distance. In the work of Isaac Newton and his followers, Foucault draws on Canguilhem's conceptual history of the milieu, and Canguilhem shows that while Newton did not use the notion, he employed the term fluid instead, it has a strategic importance in the search for a solution to a problem in contemporary mechanics. The question of how one body sets another in motion without having any physical contact. According to Canguilhem, Newton came to understand fluid as an intermediary element located between two bodies, for example, light source and eye, that exist in the medium in which they move. I quote, no, I'll leave out the quote, too many quotes. The third aspect, biology. The mechanistic notion of the milieu was subsequently taken up and transformed in the discipline of biology, constituted in the 18th century. It became a central concept used to account for the relationship between living entities and the natural environment. While the French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck adopts the mechanical sense of a milieu as a totality of forces that act on an organism from the outside, this model of explaining life in terms of a complex of causal determination originating in its environment is increasingly displaced by an altered meaning of the milieu. This conceives of organisms as actively creating and transforming the milieus they inhabit. This conceives of organism, while in the former the organism functions mechanically within delimited spaces, the later takes into account that, I quote, Canguilhem, it is characteristic for the living that it makes its milieu for itself, that it composes its milieu. End of quote. Okay, so far the brief genealogy of the milieu. While Foucault draws on Canguilhem and his reconstruction of the notion of the milieu, he also departs from his teacher's historical interpretation, as he particularly attends to how the milieu is set in motion within a new form of calculation and control, a perspective that is absent in Canguilhem's account. Foucault only alludes briefly to the theoretical debate about the notion of the milieu in physics and biology, as this discussion focuses on what he called the pragmatic structure it gave rise to. He links the interest in controlling circulations that emerged in the 18th century to a new configuration of power that he distinguishes from sovereignty on the one hand and discipline on the other. Foucault presents the Western European city as a paradigmatic example of how circulations are fostered and managed from the 18th century on within this governmental regime. From the very beginning, he stresses that the issue of circulation poses the problem of governing complexes of humans and things. It encompasses a heterogeneous ensemble of material artifacts and discursive arrangements, of artificial infrastructures and natural environments, addressing, I quote, the fine materiality of human existence and coexistence, of exchange and circulation, end of quote. By circulation, Foucault understands the material instruments that enable certain mobilities, roads, rivers, canals, bridges, public spaces, etc. However, the term is not restricted to material networks, but also encompasses what Foucault calls circulation itself. I quote, the set of regulations, constraints, and limits, or the facilities and encouragements that will allow the circulation of man and things, end of quote. Briefly, circulation is conceived of as material as well as semiotic. It is a technical as well as a social issue. Furthermore, circulation encompasses both the mobility of humans and the movements of goods and non-human organisms. The milieu systematically integrates the geographic, climatic, or hydrographic conditions of human existence and the coordinates of social life. Thus, the milieu articulates the link between a natural given space and an artificially constructed space without systematically distinguishing between them. It is, I quote Foucault again, a set of natural givens, rivers, marshes, hills, and a set of artificial givens, an agglomeration of individuals, of houses, etc. End of quote. In this understanding, the milieu is more than an environment, a background, or a surrounding in which individuals and populations live and evolve. It is an interactive space, a relational network that constitutes the elements of which it consists as much as it is itself the endpoint or outcome. While the milieu is the object of regulations and adjustments, it also exhibits self-regulatory capacities that have to be respected and fostered. It defines, I quote again, an intersection between a multiplicity of living individuals working and coexisting with each other in a set of material elements that act on them and on which they act in turn. End of quote. Here Foucault quite clearly recognizes the idea that agency is not exclusively a property of humans. Rather, agential forces originate in relations between human and non-human entities. However, the milieu not only defines a spatial constellation, but also reconfigures existing temporalities. It relates, I quote again, to a series of possible events. It refers to the temporal and the uncertain, which have to be inserted into a given space. The space in which a series of uncertain elements unfold is roughly what one can call the milieu. End of quote. In this sense, the milieu is also in the middle between past events and an open future. It is not so much the target or the object of government, but rather its medium. The milieu defines a spatial temporal arrangement of a hybrid ensemble of material entities mobilized to control future trajectories and to achieve specific goals. In the case of urban circulation with regard to hygiene, trade, traffic surveillance, crime prevention, etc. It articulates what Foucault calls the problem of the treatment of the uncertain, bringing to light natural phenomena that cannot be completely controlled, but still possess certain self-regulatory tendencies that governmental practices might draw on. Thus, the concept of the milieu attends to the multiple, complex, recursive, and always mobile relations between interdependent elements and entities of all kinds, mobilized in circulations. Given this relational nature and the contingent arrangements of material networks, milieus are not characterized by fixed ties between singular causes and isolated effects, but rather by what Foucault calls a correlation. As elements and the milieus they inhabit emerge together. Processes of circulation are defined by serialities that lend themselves to the generation of statistical knowledge and the calculation of probabilities, and which make it possible to establish recursing patterns and structural regularities. The central point here is the intimate relationship between the government of circulations and the production of knowledge that seeks to transform uncertainties into risks and probabilities. But this will to knowledge goes beyond acquiring information on the specific materialities of the milieu and all who live in it. It also actively shapes and transforms the milieu to produce some outcomes rather than others. Thus, the milieu is not a given and pre-existing time-space, but the material condition and the technical medium of government. I quote Foucault, what one tries to reach through this milieu is precisely the conjunction of a series of events produced by these individuals, populations, and groups, and quasi-natural events which occur around them. End of quote. Now let me move to the third part of this talk. Foucault's analysis of the strategic role of the milieu within liberal governmentality coincides with an important theoretical shift in his work. In the lectures of 1978 and 1979 at the Collège de France, he defines, I quote, liberalism as the general framework of biopolitics. This results from the self-critical insight that his analysis in Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, had exclusively addressed processes involving population, regulation, and the corporal disciplining of individual bodies. The analytics of government, focusing on circulations of humans and things, makes it possible to revise the original research agenda. Foucault now not only draws attention to the production of individual and collective bodies, but also proposes a more comprehensive concept of biopolitics that takes into account the entanglement of human and non-human entities. This broader understanding of biopolitics materializes in the lectures at the Collège de France in 1978, when Foucault discusses Jean-Baptiste Moreau's Recherche et considération sur la population de la France, a book published originally in 1778. He describes the author as, I quote, the first great theorist of what we could call biopolitics. Moreau's book was one of the first to state that knowledge about the state of the population is essential for governmental work. It deals with a variety of factors that determine the characteristics of a population, encompassing physical elements as well as political or moral ones, without neatly distinguishing between them. Foucault builds his argument on the central importance of the milieu by quoting approvingly Moreau's insight that government means, I quote, to govern the physical and moral existence of their subjects. Although Moreau's book does not mention the term, it still proposes, I quote, a political technique that will be addressed to the milieu, end of quote. According to Moreau, even climatic or geographic conditions are subject to governmental calculations and interventions, as it is their objective to alter the course of things. It is quite clear that the governmental rationality Moreau proposes is limited neither to the domain of the social nor to directing human beings. Rather, it articulates an extensive understanding of things and their correlations and their circulations that addresses the relations between the natural and the artificial, the human and the non-human. In Moreau's political imaginary, the sovereign deals less with human nature than, I quote, with the perpetual conjunction, the perpetual intrication of a geographic, climatic and physical milieu with the human species insofar as it has a body and a soul, a physical and moral existence. End of quote. The reformulation of the concept of biopolitics within a more than human analytics of government entails two important dimensions. First, we see a move beyond an understanding of biopolitics as limited to the physical and biological existence to a more complex idea of a government of things. The latter acts on the milieu as it provides the point of articulation between the natural and the artificial, the physical and the moral. It exceeds disciplining and regulating individual and collective bodies to include processes of subjectivation and moral problematizations. In this light, human nature is not an anthropological universal to be taken for granted, but is articulated within practices that are conceived of as more than human processes. There's a second difference between the concept of biopolitics Foucault had favored in earlier publications and the one he sketches in the governmentality lectures. Not only does the government of things relate to the interplay of physical and moral, biological and non-biological issues, but the biological can only play out in a certain milieu. In this perspective, neither nature nor life is a self-evident or stable entity or property. Rather, Foucault refers to, I quote, a multiplicity of individuals who are and fundamentally and essentially only exist biologically bound to the materiality within which they live. End of quote. In this perspective, life is not a given but depends on material conditions of existence within and beyond biological processes. This understanding of the milieu not only disrupts conventional ideas of exteriority and externality, but also urges humans to recognize alterity in their own humanness, thereby going beyond traditional concepts of embodiment. Thus, non-human doings are the precondition for humans to emerge and to exist. Foucault's extensive understanding of biopolitics attends to the multifold entanglements of humans and non-humans. However, the notion of biopolitics has mostly been used in a much more limited sense since Foucault's death, exclusively addressing what Foucault once called phenomena peculiar to the life of the human species. Paul Rabinow and Nicholas Rose have famously argued that the notion of biopower is not applicable in non-human contexts as it pertains to, I quote, more or less rationalized attempts to intervene upon the vital characteristics of human existence, end of quote. According to this interpretation, the operations of biopower rely on modes of subjectivations and forms of biosociality that pertains to humans only, which means that animals and other non-humans cannot be subjected to biopower. In the past 20 years, however, a growing number of scholars have sought to extend this interpretative frame of the concept. In When Species Meet, Donna Haraway emphasizes the multiple interrelations of human and animal reproductive practices, showing how the international trade in livestock and the management of breeding practices also shaped the histories of eugenics and genetics. Proposing the concept of companion species, Haraway points to the unstable boundaries between species, arguing that human and non-human life are mutually constitutive and intimately intertwined. Pointing to the limitations and weaknesses of animal rights theorists, Carrie Wolf's Before the Law, Humans and Other Animals in a Biopolitical Framework offers another way of interrogating human exceptionalism by referring to Foucault's notion of biopolitics. In a critical dialogue with the work of Agamben and Esposito, Wolf points to the repressive and deadly effects of this power over life that takes the animal as its primary object. In addition to Haraway's and Wolf's work, scholars have employed the Foucauldian notion of biopolitics to investigate breeding practices, biodiversity and species preservation policies, by environmental and agricultural management, and the role of database in governing non-human life. While this line of research has provided ample empirical evidence of how productively the Foucauldian conceptual apparatus could be used to study various forms of governing animal and plant life, the perspective advanced in this talk differs from this scholarship in one important respect. While I also suggest a more comprehensive and complex understanding of biopolitical processes, I'm not primarily interested in extending Foucault's analysis into research areas he did not deal with in his own work. Rather, I'm trying to identify ways in which the concepts already present in Foucault's writings might offer new or so far underexplored insights into how governmental practices operate. Thus, my reading provides a rather different take on the question of the non-human in Foucault, which resembles Jeffrey Nealon's recent engagement with his work. While other scholars have focused on what they found missing or inadequately dealt with in Foucault's account of biopolitics, seeking to extend it, Nealon discloses what is already present but often overlooked in the reception of Foucault's work. In a similar vein, I draw on conceptual tools and methodological suggestions Foucault put forward to further develop and sometimes distort them in order to outline an analytic approach that is attuned to new questions and contemporary problems. I seek to spell out the trajectories of contemporary biopolitical practices that draw on a modified understanding of the milieu in the last part of my work. And the last part is the most extensive part. So the fourth part on environmentality is the longest of the four parts of the talk. Okay. Following Brian Masumi, Ben Anderson, Jennifer Gabris, and Erich Hörl, I propose to call this new governmental regime environmentality. The notion of environmentality was introduced by Foucault in his lecture series at the Collège de France in 1979 to define an operational mode characteristic of neoliberal technologies of government that were beginning to take shape at the time. According to Foucault, the term denotes, quote, a governmentality which will act on the milieu and systematically modify its variables, end of quote. It seeks to govern the environment of human and non-human entities rather than operating directly on subjects and objects. As we will see, this environmentality marks a significant transformation of the classical modes of governing things as it engages with new technological formats and enacts an altered concept of the milieu. Importantly, the Foucauldian understanding of environmentality needs to be distinguished from more specific and delimited usages of the term that focus on analyzing environmental politics. This body of research investigates such questions as the constitution of environmentally conscious subjects, the role of environmental organizations in the management of a sustainable economy, and other related questions. Going beyond this distinctive thematic focus, Foucault's notion of environmentality proposes a much broader understanding of the environmental. It seeks to capture an essential feature of contemporary neoliberal modes of governing, the management of what Foucault calls fluctuating processes. Hence, environmentality in this sense might refer to strategies addressing environmental objectives, but it is not limited to this particular policy field. Rather, it focuses on governmental practices that seek to steer and manage performances and circulations by acting on and controlling the heterogeneities and differences that make up a milieu. The term environmentality first appears in Foucault's discussion of the neoliberal account of criminality in the lecture of the 21st March 1979 at the Collège de France. This lecture focuses on the analysis of the Chicago School and its proposal to extend the economic form of the market to the social field in general. In this neoliberal program, Foucault discerns new forms of government that are less directly concerned with targeting individual behavior or the deviant population, but rather seek to alter material conditions and contexts in order to implement regulatory strategies. According to Foucault, this environmental technology no longer pursues the project of a pervasive disciplinary society. Rather, it displaces normalizing or standardizing technologies to promote, I quote Foucault, the optimization of systems of difference, end of quote. In operating on the milieu of individuals and populations, a quote, again, a longer quote, action is brought to bear on the rules of the game rather than on the players. There's an environmental type of intervention instead of the internal subjugation of individuals, end of quote. Foucault promises to discuss this environmental regime in more detail in the following lectures. However, he never returned to the notion of environmentality. A shortened version of the 6 pages of preparatory notes for the lectures, in which he outlined his understanding of environmentality, is included as a footnote in the book publication of the lecture series. While the term certainly lacks conceptual clarity and depth, it still remains a provocative tool for thought. It provides an abstract analytic grid to investigate how current neoliberal technologies enact and rely on environmental modes of government. Indeed, the notion of governmentality puts forward a distinctive ecological understanding of the environmental as both technological and natural. I quote Foucault, the problem of the milieu to the extent that it is not a natural milieu, end of quote. The shift toward an environmental mode of government is linked to the rise of complexity science and the proliferation of the ecological since the 1970s. In this context, the concept of resilience plays a crucial role. Originally adopted in the 1970s by the ecologist Crawford S. Holling, this idea has in the last few decades become what Sarah Nelson calls the dominant paradigm for the administration of life. It informs scientific disciplines and policy areas as diverse as international development, public health, financial regulation, corporate risk analysis, the psychology of trauma, urban planning, and environmental politics. The resilience discourse makes it possible to redirect highly diverse operational procedures and strategic arrangements toward a common horizon and a single analytic frame, subjecting them to the logic and logistics of crisis. It provides a central conceptual key to rethink governmental practices, organizational processes, and institutional settings in order to address events of emergency and methods of crisis management. The concept of resilience emerged at the historical moment when the apparent political and economic failure of the Fordist regime of accumulation was joined by the growing insight into the significance of the ecological crisis, famously expressed by the Club of Rome's report on the limits to growth. The critique formulated by new social movements and environmentalist groups demonstrated that an increasing awareness of environmental degradation and resource depletion. It also highlighted the interconnections of ecological and economic questions, especially the destructive environmental effects of Fordism and the evident regulatory problems of Keynesianism. Holling's work and his adoption of the concept of resilience advocated a quite specific solution to this double crisis. While many contemporary ecologists and economists understood the Earth as a closed thermodynamic system, emphasizing the need for a steady state economy to re-establish stability in the light of finite resources and environmental limits, Holling suggested a quite different trajectory. Instead of viewing the environment as composed of stable and static entities that evolve around linear and foreseeable developmental pathways, he envisioned it as an integrated but open complex system whose dynamics escapes prediction. Holling emphasized the role of self-organization within systems and their ability to remain cohesive even after experiencing extreme perturbations. According to this approach, systems produce order by actively engaging with the environment, maintaining their constitutive relations and borders by selecting the input they need for their autopoiesis. Holling put forward an understanding of the environment in terms of an unpredictable and often turbulent ecological system. However, instead of conceiving of this dynamics as a threat to be eliminated or minimized, he proposed a new way of governing that respects and shapes it. I quote Sarah Nelson, harnessing the uncertainty generated by non-linear dynamics as a catalyst for innovation and growth, end of quote. In problematizing the conventional notion of stability and the normative ideal of homeostasis, the concept of resilience seeks to grasp how systems are able to retain structural integrity and cohesion even while undergoing extreme stress or situations of shock. If stability refers to the familiar idea of a return to equilibrium, ecological resilience designates, I quote Holling, the ability of a system to maintain its structure and patterns of behavior in the face of disturbance, end of quote. Holling advocates a particular style of government that follows from this understanding of resilience. It breaks with the kind of knowledge-based planning that characterized post-war political and economic strategies by stressing opportunism and preparedness instead of prevention and prediction. Here's a longer quote by Holling. A management approach based on resilience would emphasize the need to keep options open and the need to emphasize heterogeneity. Flowing from this would be not the presumption of sufficient knowledge, but the recognition of our ignorance. Not the assumption that future events are expected, but that they will be unexpected. The resilience framework can accommodate this shift in perspective, for it does not require a precise capacity to predict the future, but only a qualitative capacity to devise systems that can absorb and accommodate future events in whatever unexpected form they may take. End of quote. The concept of resilience has come to reorient policies as it shifts the problem from the re-establishment of stability to the question of how to support and foster adaptive capacities in uncertain ecologies. It redefines the problem of security as a matter of flexible adaptation under conditions of irreducible uncertainty and inevitable threat. Confronted with an environment of disruptive events and incalculated risk, the challenge is how to design systems able to adjust to and benefit from future shocks that are in principle unavoidable and unforeseeable. Resilience has become the normative yardstick to measure individual and organizational fitness, to adapt to traumatic experiences in turbulent ecologies, as it possesses two important strengths. First, resilience points to the problem and failures of conventional management practices and traditional post-war policies to address socioeconomic change by sticking to a seemingly outdated model of homeostasis and by separating ecosystems from social systems. And secondly, Holling also proposes new ways of mobilizing nonlinear processes as the very sources of innovation and dynamism. Conceiving of unpredictable trajectories and events of crisis as drivers for economic growth, neoliberal strategies foster the emergence of new markets from catastrophe bonds to weather derivatives and hitherto unknown academic disciplines specialized in the production of knowledge about uncertain environmental futures. Furthermore, complexity theory and the concept of resilience were instrumental in reconfiguring environmental functions and services as lucrative sites for capital investment. They set the stage for a form of neoliberal environmentalism that integrates the concern about natural limits and finite resources into the circuits of capital, converting environmental critique of capitalist ecologies into a new mode of capitalist expansion. I quote Sarah Nelson again, the construction of nature as a service provider via resilience-based management techniques has enabled a major shift in the way that capital circulates through non-human natures, pricing and exchanging ecological capacities rather than stocks of material resources. End of quote. While this market-based environmentalism recognizes the infrastructural and life-supporting functions of animals, rainforests, and watersheds, for example, by pollinating crops, sequestrating carbon dioxide, or filtering water, it conceives of these capacities as natural capital, assets that must be privatized, monetarized, and commodified in order to address biodiversity loss, climate change, and the depletion of resources. The concept of natural capital and ecosystem services have now become an integral part of mainstream economics and environmental politics, giving rise to a diversity of markets, policies, and programs to identify and assess the economic value of ecological work. While complex systems theory and second-order cybernetics started as a critique of Keynesian economics and Cold War politics that centered around concepts of homeostasis and stability, they soon became an integral part of a new capitalist regime. The advent of resilience theory marked a stark contrast to the post-war constellation in which classical thermodynamics and mechanical concepts of equilibrium played a central role. Thus, after World War, maybe I still go into this in a bit more detail. After World War II, they provided the model for economic and ecological organization guided by the regulatory idea of a foreseeable and measurable trajectory that results in the return of the status quo ante after perturbation. Holling's work consists in destabilizing and finally overthrowing this familiar narrative. It represents the beginning of a major transformation in which, and I quote Brian Masumi now, the figure of the environment shifts from the harmony of a natural balance to a churning seedbed of crisis in the perpetual making. End of quote. Thus, the neoliberal agenda entails both a departure from the regulatory idea of equilibrium and a re-evaluation of crisis. Crisis is no longer necessarily to be avoided, something exceptionally and temporal. It is seen instead as a creative resource and essential precondition of innovation and change. It follows that the strategic imperative is less to prevent events from happening, but rather to prepare for a future where crisis is ubiquitous and catastrophic outcomes are to be confronted. Contemporary forms of government redefine and redesign technologies of security in the light of all-pervasive risk and everyday danger. As security is conceived of as both problematic and normative terms, as it tends to restrict innovation and change, and is practically unachievable in the light of multifold challenges and experiences of crisis, from the economic crisis to climate change, this new form of government, of governing humans and non-humans, works without the promise of a future beyond all crisis. Thus, Bruce Brown states that in important respects, resilience is the name for our contemporary form of biopolitics. Viewed through the broadest of lenses, we might posit that resilience is a mode of government proper to neoliberalism, in which government seeks not to punish or to prevent or discipline, but rather to modulate natural processes by creating a milieu. End of quote. And now let me conclude. In this talk, I proposed an understanding of biopolitics that no longer exclusively addresses human individuals and populations, but attends to the complex associations of humans and non-humans. The notion of the milieu is essential for this more than human understanding of biopolitics. After revisiting the brief genealogy of the term in Foucault's lectures on governmentality at the Collège de France, I argued that the milieu occupies a central role in liberal governmentality as it seeks to control and canalize free circulations across the human-non-human divide. Since it attends to the co-constitution of human and non-humans, the milieu also allows for a non-anthropocentric framing of biopolitics. Finally, I diagnosed an important transformation in contemporary modes of government. Instead of targeting directly human individuals or populations, they seek to modulate and control the social, ecological, and technological conditions of life. I proposed Foucault's concept of environmentality as a way of addressing this new constellation of power, identifying the central role of technologies of resilience. Technologies of resilience, however, as Sarah Nelson rightly notes, no longer correspond to Foucault's earlier description of biopolitics. In Foucault's classical analysis, the two central elements of biopolitical interventions, the disciplining of the individual body and the regulation of the collective body of the population, are characterized by a stable bond. It connects them and keeps them apart as two distinct areas, making it possible to generate norms within the human sciences and new statistical and demographic knowledge. Biopolitics in this sense takes the form of a convergence of disciplinary mechanisms focused on the individual with regulatory mechanisms that intervene at the level of the population. By contrast, mechanisms of resilience exploit and foster differences and deviances. As Nelson notes, they seek to capitalize on alterity rather than mitigate it. Technologies of resilience no longer claim to predict or prevent, but seek to adapt and accommodate disruptive future events. Instead of relying on quantifiable rates of occurrence, statistical averages, and normal curves of distribution, they refer to qualitative properties, structural patterns, and complex relationalities that define a system. This environmental mode of governing seeks to control the comprehensive natural and technical infrastructures of life, addressing not just biological life, but the material conditions required to sustain and foster certain ways of life or modes of living. As Erich Hörl has noted, environmentality is defined by the simultaneous proliferation and denaturalization of the ecological. While there is today hardly any field or object that cannot be framed in ecological terms, the concept is increasingly decoupled from any reference to nature. However, the diagnosis of contemporary environmental forms of government does not signal an all-pervasive and totalizing form of domination. While environmentality further promotes the idea of universal adaptability and controllability, it also gives rise to a more comprehensive understanding of ecology beyond neo-cybernetic power, endorsing an integral account that problematizes the modern opposition of nature and culture, the human and the non-human. Sarah Nelson has noted an ironic tension in the resilience discourse and its focus on adaptability. While its emergence is intimately linked to mechanisms of flexible accumulation and constitutes an integral element of the rise of neoliberalism since the 1970s, resilience theory could be transformed or reappropriated as a critical tool that undermines neoliberal strategies to promote a socio-ecological common beyond capitalist control. The critical appropriation of the resilience discourse offers crucial I quote Nelson, theoretical tools for an anti-capitalist ecological politics, both for understanding the capitalist ecologies it currently informs and for developing an exit strategies from them, end of quote. Thus, this denaturalized and technologized concept of ecology might also be helpful to imagine an ontological politics that focuses on relationalities and transgresses current forms of technocratic and capitalist control. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Thomas, for this wonderful lecture. Now, if anyone of the viewers, if anyone out there has any questions, now is the time. You can write it in the chat, that you can find it on the right side of your screen. Otherwise, we already have some questions, so I will just read them out. The first one goes like this. Would you consider non-anthropological biopolitics, as you describe it, as a condition of possibility of the sorts of ontologies developed by, for example, Bruno Latour or Graham Harman? So the question is if like the things, the stuff that you're doing here, if this is a condition of possibility of the sort of new realist ontologist like Bruno Latour or Graham Harman's ontologies.
Yes, in a way. I mean, I think the most common consensus, so to say, would be to move from an anthropocentric frame to a non-anthropocentric or a more than human frame. And this, I guess, is what scholars like Graham Harman or Bruno Latour would have in common with this account of Foucauldian biopolitics that I try to advance. But I think the important question then is not the more than human, but rather the biopolitics element in it, you know. And I don't, for example, in Graham and Harman, I don't see any interest in something like biopolitics. I mean, I think this is a more aesthetic account, but not really an account that is, I think, productive for understanding contemporary power relations or something that is substantially covered by the notion of biopolitics. With Bruno Latour, it's a bit more complicated, but for me, Harman is a very easy case, and one chapter of my upcoming book is devoted to a critique of object-oriented ontology and Graham Harman's work, because I don't think that this is really helpful or fruitful for developing something like an analytic of government to understand contemporary power relations.
Thank you. So you've criticized a bit Graham Harman. Now we have the second questions. The second question. Could you name some methodological advantages of non-anthropological biopolitics if compared to traditional / anthropological biopolitics?
Okay, yeah. One thing would be, I mean, this is quite obvious, I think, that by enlarging the frame, so to say, of biopolitics, it's possible to see similarities as well as differences from governing humans as compared to governing non-humans. Instead of, in a way, limiting the biopolitical frame to the government of human collectives or human individuals, then, for example, as I said with reference to Donna Haraway's work, it's possible, or Carrie Wolf's work, it's possible to see how, in a way, there's something, the way how we govern, for example, animals, that there is something common, that certain technologies and certain accounts, in a way, are transferred from the breeding of animals, for example, that inform later than reproductive technologies for in use for producing human babies. You know, so I mean, it's just it becomes possible then to not to restrict the analysis to the governing of humans, but to see these differences, as I said, the differences as well as similarities that inform certain rationalities and certain technologies that in a way transgress the human-non-human divide. And in order to do that, in order to, in a way, really to be able to analyze how the difference between the human and the non-human is enacted in certain fields, where you have to have a larger frame of biopolitics, because this is in a way a distinction and a separation that is itself to be something to be historically and politically enacted and has to be analyzed as such, not as a given, but something that is permanently produced. And therefore it needs, we need something like a modern human biopolitics.
Okay, so I think we have only one question left. It's actually my question. You said that you were preparing a critique of Grant Harman. Could you give us perhaps a taste of it? Like what is your critique exactly, or more, if you could speak about it more in details?
Yeah. I mean, there are several critical points I would say. One is I don't really buy this idea of the withdrawnness of object and the idea that that these objects are stable and fixed, you know, and that they, I mean, it's really the difference, what he calls the new essentialism that he wants to advocate, you know. I'm more convinced of a relational account that these stable entities that he calls objects are permanently produced and redefined, you know. So there's first of all, I have problems with this new essentialism that he promotes, that he wants to foster, but also in terms of the analysis that he gives to account for political and historical developments, especially in this. There's a small book called Immaterialism, where he refers to certain case studies. Case study of the what is called East Indian Company, where in a way he relies on very traditional forms of historical analysis that are, I think, completely outdated. Great man making history, you know, and to come up with a historical account of this particular trade organization by referring to great men as objects seems to be not sufficiently complex to account for the historical and political developments.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's it. I thank you, Thomas, for your lecture. It was a pleasure. And for the viewers, I invite you to join the next lecture, which will be on Monday. The speaker will be Sandro Mezzadra, and see you then.
Thanks a lot again. And it's a weird format, but still I enjoyed it. And I hope you, I hope you got something from this very, very long talk. I rarely give a talk that long. I hope it wasn't too boring, and it gave you some ideas of what I'm going to argue in the book. Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Bye-bye.
Bye.